how you doing?
Good, how are you?
Good. I'm Jim Murphy. I'm in the English department, and I'm also the director of the university's Irish Studies program. So maybe you have an interest in that topic, or else you'd be in some other room maybe. But maybe you're here because some teacher told you you had to get your rear end in here, so you're kind of stuck with something and you picked this one. But if you want to talk to me afterwards about studying abroad in Ireland, I'd be happy to do that for you, okay? But in the meantime, the topic is the Great Irish Famine, potato famine, which you may have heard of. But part of the issue I'd like to raise with you today is whether or not famine is the right word to interpret what happened in Ireland 150, 160 years ago. I'd also like you to think, you might be here partly, again, because you had to do this, maybe you had to come, maybe you didn't, but maybe your name is Murphy or your name is Kelly, and you think, well, what the hell, I'll go to something Irish, it might be interesting. And that's fair enough. But I think the Irish famine 160 years ago was certainly not the world's first famine, but one of the first of such kind of catastrophic events that occurred in relatively modern times, so therefore we know a little more about it, you know? There's more of a record that we can begin to interpret. But whether or not you're Irish, again, doesn't really matter, in the same way that in the spirit of the Martin Luther King School and commemoration, we're trying to think of issues that are relevant to not just civil rights, but human rights, issues that touch upon not something 160 years ago in a tiny little island at the ass end of Europe, you know, but an issue that, even though it goes back to that place, raises things we can think about today. Just quickly, this is actually from last year's statistics from an organization called Bread for the World. And they say that 852 million people across the world are hungry. It's a hell of a lot of people, you know, 852 million people. And today, 5 billion people live in the developing world, which is made up of about 125 low-income countries in which people generally have a lower standard of living, certainly than we would be accustomed to here on the very comfy main line of suburban Philadelphia. In the developing world, 5 billion people, 1.2 billion of those live below the international poverty line. That's 1.2 billion people, okay? Meaning they earn less than $1 a day. Among this group, many obviously have trouble obtaining food. So we estimate that 815 million people in the developing world are undernourished. Okay? They consume less than the amount of calories which would be essential for sound health and growth, etc. So hunger, famine, if you like. Famine, of course, is in its usual connotations, the result of a natural disaster, a drought, whatever it might be. There's simply no food available, and we know this happens in lots of places in the world. Africa, in particular, is devastated and has been devastated by recurring such droughts and consequent famines. There's just simply nothing growing, you know. At the same time, the world generally has an abundance of food, as you know, from the amount of food you leave on your plate when you get up from dinner, you know. So food is available. There's a lot of food thrown into bins here at Villanova every day. Half-eaten hamburgers, you know, pizza crusts. God knows what else it might be. You taste it, you just don't like it, you say the hell with it, you know. And the fact that the most common adjective for food in our world is probably fast. You know, fast food. It shows you something about how we treat food. It's something we blitz in and out, we grab some, we keep going, you know. We drive along eating our Big Mac and keep going. What we don't finish goes in the trash. So an awful lot of food is in the world, while at the same time a lot of the world is hungry, you know. So in that, when you look at it from that point of view, then elements of famine/hunger are partly political in nature, in that we are called upon to think about ways of maybe shifting the balance, you know. Organizations like Philabundance. You know Philabundance in Philly? What's Philabundance all about? Yeah.
Collecting food.
From where?
Wherever.
Well, they don't go to your house or my house.
No, but from different companies.
Yeah, where is there likely to be a lot of food at the end of the day to be gotten rid of? Where would you think?
Like grocery stores before the stuff.
Grocery stores, no, restaurants. Okay. So Philabundance is a mini version of the effort to recognize, okay, there is an abundance of food, but there's also hungry people around, and let's try to somehow use the one to solve the problem of the other. So I don't know if you call that a political response or not, but it's a response that has to come from the collective will of some people who get together and decide, hey, we can do something about this. So multiply it globally, you know. And you don't have to think about the developing world, because even in the USA, as we speak, and probably not too far from us, there are people hungry. But you wouldn't call it famine, you know. For the Irish example, there's a poem that's sitting up there. I won't belabor you with a poem, but it's from the Irish poet Seamus Heaney, and if you take a quick look at it, it deals with the concept of digging. It's particularly a nice poem because it compares what he does for a living, or what you and I do for a living. I know you're not doing it yet, but probably when you do it, you won't be working hard manual labor. You might be. If you're in construction, civil engineering or something, you'll probably be a boss, you know. You probably won't be up on your knees on the roof spreading tar. You'll be telling somebody else where to do it. So you'll probably be like me, as your hands will be soft, you won't be heavily calloused, and you'll work at a desk. You'll work with this thing here. You'll work with the pen. I see some of you taking notes, so some of you are doing the thing that the poem deals with. You look at the first lines. Between my thumb and finger, the squat pen rests, which is what it is for a lot of us from the time we go to preschool, you know. We're learning how to handle the pen and what we can do with the pen. So the poem, I won't read it, but the poem deals with the fact that he's realizing he's the first in his generation, his family, to work with the pen, whereas everybody else had worked with the spade. They would have been farmers' sons, you know. And presumably, if you went back and say, well, what did your father do? And the answer was farmer. And what did his father do? It would probably be farmer, farmer, farmer. Farmer, farmer, you know, way back into the dim, distant past. And then somewhere in my family and yours, 2-3 generations ago, maybe for you, there was a kind of a shift. In my own case, it was my own generation. My mom and dad both emigrated from Ireland. My mom when she was 16, my dad when he was 21. And my dad became a Wonder Bread van driver in Brooklyn, New York. Okay, so the Murphy family sequence for me is farmer, my grandfather, whom I never met, right? My dad, bread van driver, me, PhD, lecturing in a major university. It's an incredible shift, you know what I mean? Incredible shift off the farm. But one of the metaphors that we use for work, as in digging, suppose you're in nursing, and I say, well, you're a nursing student, what field are you going to go into? You might say, well, obstetrics or something like that. You know, Or you want to go to law school. I might again say, what field do you want to be in? You say, well, I'm interested in corporate law, or I'm interested in being a prosecutor, or whatever it might be. But the word I keep using is field, you see, which goes back to that old notion that the major work we do as human beings is in a field. You see. So what field are you in? My field is Irish literature. But I don't actually dig in that field, you follow me? I use the pen, the library. The field where I work is a desk rather than a field that I plow. But if you think of the metaphor, it's quite a valid one for what we do at universities. We try to dig into things, you know what I mean? We try to, as the saying goes, get to the bottom of it. Because if we can get to the bottom of something, we think we can understand it. So that's what we're trying to do today here, is to get to the bottom of it. The Irish famine, talk about it, the Irish hunger, look at some statistics, and then look at some of the manifestations of it that go beyond just issues of hunger to issues like emigration. Why did my parents leave Ireland? My mom, like I say, when she was 16, never to go home again. Can you imagine that? Some of you might be homesick here at Villanova because you miss your boyfriend or your girlfriend. But Jesus Christ, leave at 16 and never go home again. And that's quite a human story. It's being acted out today, and it'll probably be a big issue in the coming presidential elections. What do we feel about immigration? What does immigration mean? How does immigration transform our definition of ourselves as Americans? What do borders mean, you know? So the issues that are raised here still resonate. Not for Irish people. Irish people are doing very well these days, okay? Irish people are quite comfortable. But for a long, long time, that wasn't true. He told me how to work this thing. Let me figure it out again. Excuse me, I'm just trying to go to the next picture.
Try the right arrow.
Yes.
Try the right arrow.
Yeah, this right arrow here, yeah.
Down.
Huh?
Try the space bar. Space bar.
Hip? I need you experts here.
There we go.
There you go, this one here. I'll go with this one. Thank you. These are just some statistics to absorb. You don't need to write them down. There's no quizzes here, but you can see 1843, the usual dates for the Irish famine in terms of the actual crop failure, okay, would be 1845 to 1850. Okay, so a 5-year period. During that 5-year period, for 4 of those 5 years, the potato crop failed. Okay? We'll talk a little bit more about why that was so devastating, but you can see, you presume that maybe 1843 would be a normal death rate, and then suddenly, boom, you can see how the numbers go way, way up, reaching in 1849 almost 250,000 people, all right? Evictions, you can see what happens during this period here. Evictions become an issue that leads not only to death, but also to, obviously, emigration. If you're kicked off the land, what do? Remember, too, that Ireland, if you don't know it, Ireland is a very small country. You could put Ireland into Pennsylvania and have lots of room left over. Okay? So it's not as though you lose your job, say, in Philadelphia, or you have to move out of your house in Philadelphia because you can't pay the rent. At least there's some space to move. If you got a few bucks, you can get on a bus and try your luck in Chicago, you know. You can do something maybe. Or you can wind up homeless on the streets. So homelessness is also an issue that's a consequence of this. And of course, why would people be evicted? Because they couldn't pay their rent, you know. And that's another issue we'll talk more about. That's simply a picture of a healthy, nice, happy potato plant. Okay? This is an illustration of a family who are discovering that their potato has the blight, meaning that the roots are diseased. Potatoes are a ground crop, okay? You dig for potatoes, which was referred to in the Heaney poem. You dig for potatoes, so when you see the fungus on the leaf, then you know that what's underneath is going to be just rotten or about to rot. Okay? So in this case, the family realizes that the loss of this single crop is going to be devastating. Okay? So again, one of the questions lingering in the background of this, and it was this way for me too, when I was your age, and I came from an Irish background, so I'd occasionally hear a reference, to the potato famine, or I might occasionally hear it referred to in a song or something. The question still occurred to me, well, why the hell would the failure of potatoes lead to a famine? Why not eat corn? Catch fish, shoot a rabbit. There are other things to do. If suddenly I couldn't get potatoes, I do pretty well here in the cafeteria. I might miss my French fries, but son of a bitch, I could survive. With the one crop, potato. But it's announced here in a Gardener's Chronicle. You can see it's a London paper from 1845, and it's announced with great regret. But one of the things I think is interesting about it is the real notion here of gardening is in the events scheduled up here. You see, you're clearly dealing with an English society doing their gardening, having a horticultural show next week that you might find of interest, By the way, the potato seems to have failed in Ireland. What a shame. But let's hope it doesn't affect our azaleas. The population of Ireland in 1790, you can see it was 4 million, and 1841, just 50 years later, it had doubled. Okay? But to put things in a kind of perspective, we know these numbers pretty exactly because in the UK, there was, at least as best they could do it, a census in 1840. Okay, so we can figure the numbers are pretty reliable. And the population of England in 1840 was 16 million. Ireland was 8. If you think about it in terms of today's numbers, that doesn't quite register. You see, today, 1995, Ireland is 5.3 million. Now that's 160 years after the failure of the crop, right? Okay. In a country of traditionally high birth rates. I don't know if you're Irish or not, but some of you probably are. My mom was one of 8. My dad was one of 13. Now that's pretty high. 13 is really gone. It's a high score, double figures. But a country that has a rate like that, and yet 150 years later, its population still hasn't reached what it was in 1840. Something is wrong with those numbers that we have to kind of account for, And the answer would be, of course, emigration would be the reason. It's only since 1995 that the Irish population has shown a net increase each year. You follow me? So that's a long, long time. So you could say that the famine, the hunger, the consequences of it in terms of the Irish population lasted 150 years, not just 5 years when the crop failed. Does that make sense to you? In other words, my mom and dad, who emigrated in the 20s, which was long after the actual failure of the crop, would be considered post-famine immigrants. Okay? Because the devastation to the rural agricultural economy went so deep that it took 150 years before the Irish economy could support itself. Right? Now, if you have Irish roots and you don't quite know where they came from, but you're kind of Irish, and maybe it goes back to your great-grandfather or something whom obviously you don't know. You might not even know what county he came from. anybody who's going back to great-grandfatherhood is going back to a famine-related emigration. Right? That makes sense to you? So if you're of Irish background, and you talk to your mom and dad sometimes, where do we come from in Ireland, you know? I don't know, I think maybe it's County Mayo, you think, we're not sure. Somewhere there. It's back there somewhere, and it's vaguely meaningful to you on St. Patrick's Day when your name is Kelly, so you have a green beer or something like that. You do the usual thing, you know? If you do that stuff on St. Patrick's Day this year, at least let a little bit of your consciousness be aware of all this stuff. In America, as of the last census in America, 43 million people in America listed themselves as having Irish descent. The whole bloody country only has 5. How could there be 43 here who claim that linkage? You follow me? Again, the answer would be emigration. And not just emigration, but massive waves of emigration. If I used my own father's example again, my father was one of 13. 10 of them came to America. Okay? Mostly, as I grew up, to New York City. That's devastating economically. If you think about it, it's also a devastating experience psychologically on both sides. I always thought of it in terms of how hard it must have been for my mother, because I knew my mother. I never knew my grandparents, you know what I mean? So I didn't think about them. It's only now I'm a grandparent myself, I begin to think, Jesus, what was that like to see 10 of your children go out the door on a one-way ticket? Not going away to school to Villanova, you know. Just walking over here, I saw a girl coming out of Kennedy with a big box from J. Crew. And somebody had sent her a care package from J. Crew, you know. Okay, all well and good. Shit, she's only back to school a week and a half. How cold could she be, you know? So she needs a care package. So she's away from home, and people feel badly she's away from home, and maybe she feels a little bad, and her mom and dad feel bad, but that's not really away from home compared to the way people emigrate today, you follow me? Not just from Ireland, okay? I have work going on in my house. 2 of the guys working there are from Guatemala. I have no clue if they're legal or illegal. It doesn't matter to me. They're working their asses off. I'm happy to have them there, you know. But they're from Guatemala. Talk about being away from home, you know. Maybe wives, maybe children. Mom and dad for sure. So you can see there that the Irish, look from 1841 to 51, 10-year period, in a country that's growing, usually growing rapidly, suddenly it's down 2 million people. That's like a quarter of the population almost. You follow me? Now, look at this. And try to digest it, so to speak. Right? Now, you could say, boy, those people really like potatoes. Why such a dependence on potatoes? You can see here now, we can talk about why in a minute, but you can see that if you did consume that much, or anything remotely close to it, then if that was suddenly gone, your diet is, you know, enormously impacted by it. Okay? But why do you think? I never knew this growing up. I just thought Irish people liked potatoes, which we did. We ate it. When my mom learned how to make spaghetti and meatballs, you know, from an Italian neighbor, and we all loved spaghetti and meatballs because kids love spaghetti and meatballs, you know. And we'd have it for dinner regularly because we loved it. And my dad liked it too, but my mom always had to give my dad a couple of boiled potatoes on the side, or for him it didn't count as his main meal. You know, I mean, there had to be a potato somewhere on the plate to say this is dinner. So there is a fondness for the potato, but that doesn't account for this. I mean, you can like French fries, but Jesus Christ, you couldn't. You know what I mean? Why do you think the Irish population, or a large part of it, might be so dependent on the potato? Take guesses. Yes,
Is
sir.
the soil good for growing them?
Yeah, the soil and the climate, and the Irish soil and climate is not great overall, okay? Generally speaking, as you go west in Ireland, you get into beautiful, but stonier and stonier land. It's quite beautiful if you're a tourist. It would be a real pain in the ass if you were a farmer. You know, so the land gets worse as you go along, and the potato flourished in that soil and in a climate that tends to be rainy and damp. Okay. Yes, sir.
There wasn't much else to eat.
Well, that's true, but there was stuff to eat. You see, there was stuff to eat. This is in the very years we're talking about. There was a lot of grain being exported from Ireland, and it was just, again, the one crop to fail. There wasn't widespread failure of everything, which you might get today in Africa from drought, say, you know? This is just one crop, one fungus hit attached one crop. Why else might potato be good here? It was cheap and abundant, you know. You get lost too much in Irish history here, okay? But the Irish population at the time, the Catholic, native, Gaelic-speaking part of the population, okay? As distinguished from the population of Anglo-Irish settlers. Am I making sense? There's the Anglo-Irish. Ireland had been colonized, right? Ireland was England's first colony. A lot of the methods used to colonize Ireland were then used here in the States, because it's right around the same time. So it's an interesting thing to study. For instance, the notion of a plantation, which is still a word we use in the South. It's a tourist spot in the South. If you go down to Charleston, maybe you visit one of the big plantations, you know. So plantation was a concept of colonization. What it meant was you didn't colonize a place with an army. That never really works, as people are still trying to learn, you know. Never really. You can occupy a place, but you can't actually take it over in any significant way. The way you can do that is to readjust the whole culture, and you do that by bringing in your own culture. So you come to Plymouth Rock not with a bunch of guys with muskets, but with wives and children, the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, the school teacher. Almost overnight you have a community, you know. Right? And then gradually you spread that out and colonize not just the people, in this case Native Americans over here, and in this case Native Irish, but you colonize their tongue. Okay? The saying in Ireland was, if the tongue is Irish, the heart will be Irish too. Therefore, one of the things we need to do here is cut out the tongue. That becomes a fundamental principle of English colonization, which stretches into the modern world, boys and girls, right? Because at the beginning of the 20th century, it was true that the sun never set on the British Empire. The Irish model is really interesting to study. It's not disconnected, believe it or not, from why there are young boys and girls your age in Baghdad and Afghanistan as we speak, okay? Iraq did not exist as a country. It was established in post-colonial Britain. Pakistan did not exist as a country, okay? It was created when the English left India, okay? So there's the whole kinds of interesting lessons about going into a place is one thing, getting out of it is another thing altogether. As we know at the moment as we speak, you know, there's all kinds of problems about how to get out of a place once you're in it. It seemed easy enough to go in and topple a statue of Saddam Hussein. It seemed easy, it seemed a piece of cake, you know. The son of a bitch. It's more complicated than that, and nobody told us. So there was grain exports, while, and to where? To England. Okay, England is in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, its population expanding, large urban growing centers like Charles Dickens's London, okay? Ireland is a major source of food for the expanding English economy. Right? Now this is obviously going to raise the political question. Like I said before, there's food available today, but people are hungry. How do governments respond in this kind of a situation? You and I are somewhat conditioned in our country, thank God, that if there's a natural disaster, somehow government has a responsibility to intervene. Thus, it's controversial whether or not the government did enough in New Orleans after Katrina, you follow? But everybody agrees that government should do something. Nobody would sit back and say, well, that's the way it goes, you know. It's God's will. Although, I forget his name, one of those Bible-thumping radio evangelists, Pat Robertson, said this is a sign from God because New Orleans is a sinful city. Whoa, I don't want him around my house, you know. But that notion that it's a sign from God and that the people have somehow brought it upon themselves, you know. But we at least accept the principle. The government today declared X a federal disaster area, which means the Red Cross goes in, all kinds of stuff goes in to at least try to help. And then we can debate whether they do a good job or a bad job. But the basic premise, at least, is that the government steps in. In the middle of the 19th century, that concept would have been foreign. It ran counter to the whole laissez-faire, economic, free market principles of the age. You follow me? It's not the place of government to intervene in the marketplace. It's still an issue, you know, underlying, you know, debates in American politics. Big government, small government. Let the market play itself out. Should the Fed step in because we're going into a recession? You know, all these kinds of questions come up, and they're philosophical questions about your political philosophy. You know? And you can see here, this is from Charles Trevelyan. That's a misprint, by the way. It should be 1846, so I'm sorry about that. So it's 1846. Trevelyan was the Minister of State in charge of relief for Ireland. He'd be the equivalent of, I forget his name, but the guy who was director of FEMA, Federal Emergency, whatever it's called. No, it's not FEMA, is it? What is it? Is that right, FEMA?
Yeah.
FEMA. He was fired because he didn't do a good job, you know. But look at what this guy says in 1846. I think I see a bright light shining in the distance through the dark cloud which at present hangs over Ireland. The deep and inveterate social evil remains. By that he means that the Irish have a deep, inveterate, embedded evil about them. This is very interesting because it's part of the way colonizers always look at the person that's being colonized. It's the only way they can do it. Slave owners are decent people, except for the fact that they own slaves. And the only way you can own slaves is to believe that the slave is somehow a lesser human being than you are. I mean, the people running Auschwitz went to church on Sunday. You have to have some kind of a formula in your head that makes that possible, you know. So that the person you're sending to the gas chamber isn't quite a human being. You wouldn't punish your dog that way, you follow me? But you can, millions of people is okay because they're not really people. Does that make sense to you? It's kind of a mindset, you know. And he has a bit of it here. Part of it is religious. Catholic Ireland, right on the shoulder of Anglican Protestant England, you know. Catholic Ireland, a long time political enemy of England. Crucial to England's power is control of the seas. Not today, but certainly then, you know what I mean? Control of the high seas. Ireland is a country right off England's shore with deep natural harbors. Ireland as a potential naval enemy to England just couldn't be tolerated, you found? So Ireland was a troublesome spot for England in a way that their more distant colonies weren't. And the Catholic Protestant part of it is in the formula. You know how Catholics are. They breed like rabbits. They drink. The Irish do all these things that suggest they need to be civilized. And that's part of our mission as colonizers is to civilize them. Okay? We want to convert the Indians to our beliefs because their beliefs are rather barbaric. And ours are obviously civilized, you know? So this happens all over the place, yeah. So a social evil remains, and I hope I'm not guilty of irreverence in thinking that this being altogether beyond the power of man, you see, so this is beyond the power of man. Nothing human beings can do about this. Nothing we can do about a blight. Somehow it comes from God. The cure has been applied by the direct stroke of an all-wise providence in a manner as unexpected and unthought of as it is unlikely to be effectual. God grant that we may rightly perform our part and not turn into a curse what was intended for a blessing. So if this is intended for a blessing, and this is the minister in charge of relief, what kind of relief are we going to get from this man? And he's a man of good conscience, you know. There's another one, 2 years later. We think we may render some service to the public by attempting to review with the calm temper of a future generation the history of the great Irish famine of 1847. He's assuming it's over, by the way, and it's not quite over. It's from this reference to 1847, which is the darkest, the worst year of the famine, that the Irish rock group takes its name. If you know anything about Irish rock music, there's a group called Black 47. Anybody know them? Have you heard of them? They're based in New York. Black 47. That's where they get their name. And absolutely, all this stuff is very connected to Bono's interest in Africa, as his statements on the subject indicate. As an Irishman, I understand famine and what it's all about. So we're not too far removed from Bono here, just to keep you interested as we go on. Unless we are much deceived, posterity will trace up to that famine the commencement of a salutary revolution in the habits of a nation long singularly unfortunate, and will acknowledge that on this occasion supreme wisdom has educed a permanent good out of transient evil. So something good is going to come of this. You know? Perhaps the people in New Orleans will mend their ways. You can see that behind it, you know. This is advice from the newspapers to prevent fever and infections amongst the poor. I know you can't read it, so I won't belabor you with it. But it's interesting because the advice it gives is all directed to the flaws of the people. That is, it includes things like you don't wash your hands enough. Scrub your kids. Cleanliness is next to godliness, and you are fundamentally a dirty people. So if you were a little cleaner in your habits, these things might not happen to you. So it's a very patronizing kind of system of advice. Here's another one from a priest, Father Matthew, who talks about what he saw. And he's a Catholic priest, but he also has this sense of divine providence, somehow sending us this. Which must have been what the authors of the book of Genesis thought when they accounted for the flood, you know? Plagues of locusts. For reasons we don't understand, these things are sent by God. It's part of divine will. So somehow we have to look at ourselves. Look at ourselves. He says, I passed from Cork to Dublin, and this doomed plant bloomed in all the luxuriance of an abundant harvest. Returning on the third, I beheld with sorrow one wide waste of putrefying vegetation. In many places wretched people were seated on the fences of their decaying gardens, wringing their hands and wailing bitterly the destruction that had left them foodless. This is an illustration from a paper at the time, Even the illustration is interesting because although she looks very sad and she's begging, she looks pretty damn well fed. Okay? So you wouldn't want to put in an English newspaper an illustration that was particularly graphic. That's still with us today. You know? You don't get on the 6 o'clock news a gruesome picture of a soldier whose head has been blown off. You don't show those things. You're not even allowed to show pictures from Dover, Delaware Air Force Base where the coffins of U.S. military people are brought back to the States. You don't allow pictures of that. During Vietnam, which I remember, the pictures were severely censored. So when something came through subterraneously, it was shocking. A monk setting himself on fire, a famous picture from the time. Viet Cong blowing out somebody's head, the picture's so vivid you can see the blood come out, you know? Shit, you don't put that in the paper, you know? You don't want to, certain things people shouldn't see. So this woman's in trouble, but you can see she looks pretty damn, she'd be a middle linebacker. She doesn't seem to be starving. Here again, kids scrounging for food. This is another paper, the woman looking to the man there for assistance, and he's helpless, which becomes an interesting motif in Irish literature, but we won't get into that. Now, one of the things that was done and is still with us is the soup kitchen. Some of you might go to shelters for the poor and bring food and feed people. The soup kitchen at that time was associated with the Quakers. So you see at the bottom it says the Friends, Society of Friends. That would be the Quakers. Okay? So the Quakers were quite heroic at this time, and they're always heroic, actually. They're wonderful people. And when there was little or no government intervention, the Quakers opened these soup kitchens. And one of the things about Quaker soup kitchens that were different from anything set up by the government is they were completely free. No strings attached, okay? The one slight string attached was that there was usually prayer services, okay? So there was a slight evangelizing notion about it, that with the soup, but before we have soup, let us all kneel down and pray, you know? And most of the people coming in were destitute Catholics, and they were being ushered into a kind of a Protestant prayer service, you know? And the reward was soup, or food of some sort. The image of that would maybe be most familiar to you, but you might not put two and two together, is at Christmas time, all these people at the malls ringing their little bells, and they're members of the Salvation Army, you know, the Salvation Army, militant Christianity. It's not that way anymore, but that's what its origin is. And usually they have a tripod, right, with a pot, okay, which is a soup pot, historically a soup pot, okay. So you drop in your buck, and you're doing something to help the poor, and you feel good about it, and you go into the mall and shop, do whatever you have to do, you know. But the image of the Salvation Army in the soup kitchen traces itself back to one way of intervening in a disaster like this. This one is particularly meaningful to me because I found it when I was doing research on this topic 15 years ago, and it happens to be my father's hometown of Clune in County Leitrim. And it's interesting because you can see that the soup is to be sold to the destitute at a penny per quart. You see number 2 there? And somebody's being appointed treasurer, and there's a kind of flaw here because you say, wait a minute, what the fuck are you talking about? The people are destitute, they're coming in for soup, and you're charging them? Even if it's only a penny, you're charging them? But the way it worked, you look at the bottom, was subscribers. Meaning, I would contribute, I've got money, I would contribute 20 bucks. My 20 bucks is enough to buy, say, 20 quarts, you follow me? And so it had to be sponsors, in other words. And the sponsors were usually the landlords whose people were being put off the land because they couldn't pay the rent, and they would make a gesture to support the soup kitchen. And bailiffs at the bottom in the PS would be people who make the arrests for delinquent people. How am I doing? Okay? I'll move along quickly. I saw that one already. Here's some other illustrations of evictions. You see these people. And this is probably a bit romanticized, but it probably also gives you a good sense of what an Irish peasant's habitation would have looked like. You know, the thatched roof and things like that, which are things you now buy if you're a tourist, you know, cute little thatched roof piggy banks and things like that. Here, people looking back, the house is in the background there. 3 generations of people moved off the land, and again, you see the woman looking longingly at her man who's helpless to do anything. Now the man is gone, and we have the woman looking back at a scene of a cottage in ruins, because one of the things that would be done to get people out of the cottages would be to burn them out. One of the things about thatch is it burns, you know. So you burn the roof and get the people out. And this image here of the woman on her own mourning for a lost world becomes a really powerful motif in Irish culture and psyche and music, song, whatever. If you know that scene of Irish traditional music, there's lots of songs in which the speaker is a woman who has a mother maybe, or a young woman. She's lost her sons. The whole thing is a kind of metaphoric reenactment of Irish history. These are photographs now. They're not from the actual dates of the famine, but from the 1880s. So it would be post-famine in a technical sense, but still the real deal. And it does give you a sense of what a peasant's cottage or village would have looked like. And you can see there the thatched cottage, people in the native dress. This would be around the 1880s, your great-grandmother time, something like that. This is an eviction scene. You see the furniture's been taken out of the house. The police are there, and they will shortly set the roof on fire to make sure that people don't go back in. Okay. Now the landlords would want to get these people off their land. If they couldn't pay the rent, that's one reason. But also, the agricultural economy had shifted to the fact that the land was more valuable, not divided up into, say, 50 small land holdings, but as one large farm for grazing. So as you moved more to cattle and dairy farms, the farmers wanted more open space. This is an interesting picture. The woman is alone in the village, and you might not be able to make it out, but there's a whole bunch of kids right between these houses there. They seem to be hiding from the cameraman. They're afraid of the camera. She doesn't seem to have the energy to move. Some illustrations of people awaiting the ship which will take them to America, okay? Or to England or to Australia, but mostly to America. You can see there'd always been immigration to America, always people coming here. Most of them in the early numbers would be Scotch-Irish Presbyterians from the north of Ireland. They would have come to America with some money in their pockets, and they would have settled in a lifestyle that they knew from the old world, which would have been farming. They had money to buy land, so they weren't the immigrants who wound up in Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. Okay, they wound up farming good land in Virginia and things like that. And then it changes here with these great numbers which come thereafter. You can see that there, the big spike during the famine years. I'm moving along quickly because I don't want to keep you too long. This is an interesting one, an illustration of an Irish guy looking at the advertisement for a ship to New York. One of the things that's interesting about it, it becomes one of the stereotyped images of the Irishman. If you look at it, it's not too far removed from the image that Notre Dame uses, which is a kind of parody of a shamrock. I actually don't like that image. Notre Dame plays the Irish card, fighting Irish, all that shit. It was founded by French priests, for Christ's sake. Villanova's much more quintessentially Irish in its founding years When was Villanova founded? 1842, just prior to the famine. The early priests and students here were almost uniformly Irish, as you can see from the names of the buildings, you know. And it's another whole story, because this was during a time of what they called in America the know-nothings. If you remember them from junior high. They were an 1840s anti-immigrant crowd. They're around today on talk radio, you know what I mean? It was an 1840s anti-immigrant crowd, and anti-immigrant meant Catholics. Okay? And that meant primarily Irish. A generation or two later, Italians, Poles, Eastern European Jews, you know, come in different waves. But the Irish were the first great wave of ethnic immigration to urban America, which is probably where most of your background is. An illustration of an immigrant ship. That's a very idealized image of such a ship. This is another one. I like it because it has a guy named Pat Murphy who's going to America. And Pat Murphy, that's my dad's name, and Pat Murphy is not spelled correctly. And one of the things that happens in America, I'd like you to think about some of this in terms of the contemporary debate about immigration in America, is the way one perceives the newcomer. So in this case, you have two characters in the background, Uncle Sam, whom we recognize, Uncle Sam, and he's talking to John Bull. John Bull is the English equivalent of Uncle Sam, and they're trying to decide what to do about, you can see who he is, Paddy the Irishman, who looks vaguely like a gorilla. So this kind of demonizing of the Irish as monkeys. Blacks would suffer the same cartooning depictions of themselves. This is Britannia is the taller woman there. She's sheltering Hibernia, which is the Latin name for Ireland. So she's sheltering Ireland from this native Irishman himself. Again, he looks very monkey-ish, doesn't he? And you see what's on his hat is the word anarchy. And on her sword is the word the law. Okay, so that's how you have to deal with Paddy. The law. This is Uncle Sam looking at an immigrant ship. You can't read all the labels, but there's Russians, Germans, Italians, they're all there, but the one who's making the most racket is the guy who's got his fist and finger up to Uncle Sam, and he's the Irishman. Probably drunk. This is an Irishman trying to look like he's decent. So he's fundamentally he's a pig dressed up to look like he's worthy of talking to his peers. This is the Irishman's castle, his birthplace. You can see the kid and the pig in the cradle together. The kid's got a bottle of whiskey in his hands. That's his pedigree. That's his pedigree, right? This is the Irishman's first school in America. It's obviously a pub, and the kid is behind the bar. If you can see him behind the bar. This is a proud mother watching her kid crawl across the floor. If you can't read the print, she says, "Oh, that child's a true mulligan. He leaves his book and goes for the Jimmy John, as natural as a duck goes for the water." The Jimmy John is the whiskey from the John Jameson, Jimmy John. And the kid has a pipe in his mouth, and he's crawling over to the whiskey bottle, and she's proud as punch of this little kid. This is the Irishman who marries the Jewish fella, so it's anti-Irish, anti-Jew. On the left is the Jewish man, then Mrs. O'Rourke in the middle, and their son with his big Jewish nose. Okay? So this is, editorial cartoons are interesting things to study, and the way they create images. This is an Irishman looking at the gorilla in the zoo, saying, "I'm glad that there's bars between us, or how could they tell us apart?" Last but not least, from Harper's Magazine, which you may know, it's still in business today, brings us back to Martin Luther King maybe. You see the weighing scales. On the one side is the South with the black man, and on the other side is the North with the Irishman. So Civilization, which is the Harper's Weekly Journal of Civilization, is confronting these two equal dangers. In the North it's the Irishman, as in the movie Gangs of New York or something like that. And in the South, it's the black man. So at any rate, do you have any questions? So hopefully some food to think, food for thought, no pun intended, about hunger, famine, and related issues of emigration and immigration. And if you're interested in studying abroad in Ireland, where there's plenty of food these days, we can chat about that, okay?
Thank you.